In the winter of 1605, a dead man rode toward Moscow at the head of an army. His name, according to himself, was Dmitry Ivanovich, the youngest son of Ivan the Terrible, rightful heir to the throne of all the Russias, except that Dmitry had been buried in Uklich Cathedral for 14 years. How does a corpse conquer an empire, and what does it reveal about the terrifying fragility of absolute power? To understand what happened, you have to understand the world that made it possible. Russia in the final decades of the 16th century was a state built on a single, almost theological premise, that the Tsar was not merely a king, but a sacred figure, anointed by God, the protector of Orthodox Christianity, the living link between heaven and the Russian land. The Rurikid dynasty, which had ruled Muscovy for over 7 centuries, was not just a political institution, it was a cosmological fact. And when Ivan the Terrible died in 1584, leaving behind a mentally incapacitated heir named Fyodor, and a trail of catastrophic wars, famines, and the systematic destruction of the Russian nobility through his Oprichnina terror, the cosmological fact began to crack. Fyodor ruled in name while his brother-in-law Boris Godunov ruled in practice. Godunov was brilliant, cautious, politically ruthless, and deeply aware that his authority rested on borrowed legitimacy. He was not Rurikid, he was not even remotely royal by blood. He was a boyar, an aristocrat of the old service class, and in the rigid theological hierarchy of Russian political thought that made him permanently suspect no matter how competent he was. The court watched him, the church watched him, the people watched him. And when, in May of 1591, the young Tsarevich Dmitry was found dead in the courtyard of his residence in Uklich with his throat cut, everyone immediately began asking the same question: who ordered it? The official investigation, led by a commission that included the future Patriarch Filaret, concluded that Dmitry had died accidentally during an epileptic seizure, falling on a knife he had been playing with. The people of Uklich did not believe it. They rang the church bells in mourning and then in rage, and they attacked and killed the royal officials they held responsible. Godunov's response was swift and merciless. The bell itself was flogged and exiled to Siberia, one of the stranger administrative decisions in Russian history, but one that tells you everything about how seriously Muscovite power took symbolic acts. The boy was buried, the case was closed. But it was never really closed. When Fyodor died in 1598 without an heir, the Rurikid line ended. The Zemsky Sobor, the Assembly of the Land, elected Boris Godunov as Tsar. It was constitutionally legitimate, spiritually endorsed, and politically catastrophic, because it meant that for the first time in living memory, the Tsar was a man who had made himself rather than a man born into divine appointment. The difference in the minds of Russian Orthodox subjects was enormous. Godunov could rule, he could build, he could even be just. But he could never be sacred in the way a Rurikid was sacred. And that gap, that small, invisible, theological gap between legitimate and holy, was exactly the space into which a pretender could step. The man who stepped into it remains, even now, one of the most debated figures in Russian historiography. We know him as the first False Dmitry, Dmitry Pervy in Russian, and what we know about his real identity is frustratingly incomplete. The most widely accepted theory, supported by Godunov's own government and later by the Romanov dynasty that eventually emerged from this chaos, is that he was a runaway monk named Grigory Otropiev, born around 1582 into a minor noble family, who had entered the Chudov monastery in Moscow, gained access to court circles, possibly even served in Godunov's own administration, and then fled to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth sometime around 1601 or 1602. But here is where it gets complicated. We cannot prove this with absolute certainty. Otropiev himself denied it furiously, until his death. Some historians have suggested the pretender was a genuine tool of Polish noble families with their own dynastic ambitions. Others have proposed more provocatively that he might have actually believed himself to be Dmitry, or at least convinced himself sufficiently to be convincing to others. What we can say with confidence is this. By 1603, a young man had appeared in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth claiming to be the miraculously preserved son of Ivan the Terrible, and he was finding an audience. He converted, at least nominally, to Catholicism. He secured the support of the powerful Polish magnate Jerzy Mnisek, whose daughter Marina he promised to marry. He gained an audience with King Sigismund III of Poland, who offered cautious, unofficial support. Cautious because openly backing a pretender against a neighboring sovereign was diplomatically dangerous, unofficial because if it went wrong, Sigismund needed deniability. The pretender also wrote to the Zaporozhian Cossacks and the Don Cossacks, promising them privileges and recognition. He was building a coalition, and the coalition was built on a promise that he was the true Tsar, that God had preserved him, and that his restoration would mean justice for those whom Godunov had wronged. In October of 1604, the pretender crossed the Russian border from Poland with an army of perhaps 4,000 men, Polish and Lithuanian volunteers, Zaporozhian Cossacks, and Russian exiles. It was, on paper, an absurdly small force with which to conquer a state the size of Russia. And yet something extraordinary happened. Towns began to surrender without a fight. Garrisons opened their gates. Local populations, particularly in the southern borderlands, where years of famine and Godunov's heavy taxation had created a powder keg of resentment, welcomed the pretender not just as a political alternative, but as a sacred restoration. They rang their church bells for him. They brought him bread and salt. They swore oaths to him as if he were already crowned. The army grew. Boris Godunov, watching this unfold from Moscow, must have felt the specific terror of a man who has always known his legitimacy was borrowed. He denounced the pretender as a fraud, as a runaway monk, as a tool of Catholic Poland. He had the Patriarch issue condemnations. He sent armies south. In January of 1605, his forces actually defeated the pretender at the Battle of Dobronichi, routing his army and nearly capturing him. It seemed to be over. But the pretender escaped. The southern towns did not return to Godunov's obedience, and then in April of 1605, something happened that changed everything. Boris Godunov died. The death was sudden. Godunov was 53 years old, apparently in reasonable health, and then on April 13th he suffered what contemporaries described as a hemorrhage and was dead within hours. His 16-year-old son Fyodor II was proclaimed Tsar. The boy was intelligent and well-educated, raised specifically to rule, and he lasted exactly 7 weeks, because now the pretender's army was advancing again, and this time Godunov's own generals were switching sides. In June of 1605, the boyars in Moscow arrested young Fyodor and his mother. They were strangled. Their deaths were announced to the public as suicide, which fooled no one. And on June 20th, 1605, the man who called himself Dmitry Ivanovich entered Moscow in triumph. The scenes of that entry are worth pausing on because they capture something essential about what was happening. Crowds lined the streets. People wept and prostrated themselves. Monks came out with icons and crosses. The pretender rode through it all, and by every account, including hostile ones, he handled it with remarkable composure. He was young, probably in his early 20s, physically unprepossessing by the standards of Tsarist majesty. He was short, had a wart on his nose, and his arms were reportedly of unequal length, but he was charismatic, quick-witted, and possessed of a kind of restless energy that contemporaries found either compelling or unsettling, depending on their loyalties. He was crowned in the Assumption Cathedral of the Moscow Kremlin, the same cathedral where every legitimate Tsar had been crowned. The Patriarch anointed him. The bells of Moscow rang. And now the story enters its strangest phase because the false Dmitry, if he was false, proceeded to govern. He governed, moreover, in ways that were genuinely interesting and in some respects more enlightened than what had come before. He reduced the burden of serfdom in some areas. He was personally accessible in a way Russian Tsars almost never were, holding open audiences and wandering the Kremlin without the elaborate ceremonial distance that Russian court culture demanded. He showed an intellectual curiosity that struck the boyars as alarming and the foreign ambassadors as refreshing. He spoke Polish, had absorbed Western ideas during his years in the Commonwealth, and seemed genuinely interested in reforming Russian governance along lines that would have been recognizable in contemporary Western Europe. He even discussed, apparently seriously, the possibility of a crusade against the Ottoman Empire in alliance with the Catholic powers of Europe. But every one of these qualities was also a liability. His informality offended the rigid ceremonial expectations of Moscow court culture, where the Tsar was supposed to be almost inaccessibly divine. His Polish associations, his Catholic baptism, his forthcoming marriage to Marina Emnishek, a Polish Catholic woman who was never going to convert to Orthodoxy, all of these fed a growing whisper campaign among the boyars that he was not merely a pretender but a foreign agent, a Catholic plant designed to deliver Russia to Poland and Rome. The whisper campaign had a leader, Vasily Shuisky, one of the most senior boyars in Russia, a man who had actually served on the original 1591 commission that investigated Dmitry's death and who had at various points both confirmed and denied the pretender's legitimacy, depending on which answer was politically convenient for him at the time. Shuisky had been condemned to death by the false Dmitry early in his reign for plotting against him, then pardoned, a mercy that would prove fatal because Shuisky kept plotting. He built a coalition among the boyars, among the Moscow Streltsy garrison troops, and among the citizens of Moscow who had grown alarmed by the behavior of the thousands of Polish and Lithuanian soldiers who had arrived for the royal wedding in May of 1606. The Poles were arrogant, they were Catholic, they were armed, and they were behaving in Moscow as if they had conquered it, rather than accompanied a wedding party. The resentment was real and it was building. On the night of May 16th to 17th, 1606, the bells of Moscow began to ring, not in celebration, but in alarm. Armed men poured into the streets. The Kremlin was stormed. The false Dmitry attempted to escape from a window of the palace, fell, and was injured. He was found by the mob, and the accounts of what happened next vary in their details, but agree on the essential fact: he was killed. His body was dragged through the streets of Moscow. It was displayed publicly for days, with a carnival mask placed on his chest, a symbol of deception. Then it was burned, and according to some accounts, the ashes were loaded into a cannon and fired in the direction of Poland from which he had come. It was a statement, not just an execution. Vasily Shuisky was proclaimed Tsar by an assembly of boyars the very next day, which was itself constitutionally questionable. The proper procedure was a full Zemsky Sobor, not a boyar coup, and which meant that the time of troubles, the smuta, was far from over. It was, in fact, about to get dramatically worse, because the story of the false Dmitry was not finished with his death. It was only beginning. Within months of Dmitry's murder, rumors began circulating that he had escaped again, that God had preserved him again. A new pretender appeared, the so-called second false Dmitry, Dmitry Vaitori, who had no credible claim to the identity, but who attracted a following that at its peak included a substantial Polish-Lithuanian military force, the Don Cossacks under their ataman Ivan Zarutsky, and most extraordinarily Marina Emnishek herself, the widow of the first false Dmitry, who recognized the second false Dmitry as her husband, despite the fact that he looked nothing like him. Whether she genuinely believed this, or whether she was playing a political game to preserve her own position and that of any children she might bear, is a question that historians have debated ever since. The second false Dmitry established a rival court at Tushino, just outside Moscow, earning him the mocking nickname Tushinsky Vor, the thief of Tushino. And for 2 years, Russia had 2 capitals, 2 Tsars, 2 courts, and 2 sets of institutions operating simultaneously. It was a state of political schizophrenia that would have been darkly comic if it were not accompanied by famine, plague, massacres, and the systematic destruction of entire regions of the country. The chaos of the Smuta, which stretched roughly from 1598 to 1613. Killed somewhere between a quarter and a third of the Russian population through a combination of famine, disease, and the violence of competing armies. The famine alone, which struck in 1601 to 1603 and may have killed 500,000 people or more, created the social conditions that made the pretender's initial success possible. Desperate, hungry people in the southern borderlands who had nothing to lose and everything to gain from backing a claimant who promised change. The false Dmitry did not create the crisis. He was a symptom of it, and then he became an accelerant. What makes the whole episode so historically significant is not just the drama of a pretender conquering Moscow, remarkable as that is, but what it reveals about the structural vulnerabilities of the Muscovite state. The entire edifice of Russian autocracy in this period rested on a single unverifiable claim that the Tsar was divinely chosen, that his authority descended from God through the Rurikid bloodline. When the bloodline ended, that claim became contestable. And once it became contestable, the state discovered that it had almost no institutional mechanisms for resolving the contest. There was no parliament, no independent judiciary, no established constitutional procedure for succession disputes. There was the church, which could anoint or condemn, but which was itself politically vulnerable and had already shown its willingness to accommodate whoever held power. There were the boyars, who were chronically factional and self-interested. And there were the people who, in the absence of legitimate authority, fell back on the most powerful legitimating force available to them. The belief that the true Tsar was still out there, that God would not abandon Russia, that the rightful heir would return. This belief, call it the myth of the returning Tsar, proved to be one of the most durable and dangerous ideas in Russian political culture. It did not end with the Smuta. It reappeared throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, generating pretenders in almost every generation of social crisis. Stenka Razin's rebellion in 1670 to 1671 featured a pretender claiming to be the Tsarevich Alexei. The Bulavin Rebellion of 1707 to 1708 generated its own claimants. Most spectacularly, the Pugachev Rebellion of 1773 to 1775, the largest peasant uprising in Russian history before 1917, was led by a Don Cossack named Yemlian Pugachev, who claimed to be the murdered Emperor Peter III, husband of Catherine the Great. Pugachev held court, issued manifestos, appointed his own ministers, and came close enough to threatening the established order that Catherine had him tried and publicly executed in Moscow in January of 1775, a deliberate echo of earlier Tsarist responses to pretenders, designed to demonstrate that the state was permanent and the pretender was not. Each of these episodes drew on the same template established by the false Dmitry, a charismatic figure, a claim to royal identity, an appeal to the grievances of peripheral populations, Cossacks, peasants, religious dissenters, and an exploitation of the gap between the sacred theory of Tsarist authority and the often brutal, exploitative reality of Tsarist governance. The pretender phenomenon was not a series of accidents. It was a structural feature of Russian political culture, generated by the combination of absolute theologically grounded power and the chronic failure of that power to deliver justice to those at the bottom of the social hierarchy. The resolution of the original crisis came in 1613, when the Zemsky Sobor elected 16-year-old Mikhail Romanov as Tsar. The Romanovs were chosen partly because of their genuine dynastic connections. Mikhail's aunt had been married to Ivan the Terrible, and partly because they were seen as acceptable to enough different factions to hold the country together. The election of Mikhail did not end the Smuda immediately. Polish forces still occupied parts of Russia, and the second False Dmitry's former allies continued to fight for years. But it established the principle that the Russian state could survive the extinction of a dynasty and reconstitute legitimate authority through collective decision-making, even if that principle was never again formally invoked in quite the same way. The Romanovs, once established, worked systematically to close the vulnerabilities that the Smuda had exposed. They rebuilt the church's institutional authority while simultaneously subordinating it more firmly to the state, a process that culminated under Peter the Great in 1721. When the Patriarchate was abolished entirely and replaced with the Holy Synod, a state-controlled ecclesiastical bureaucracy, they codified the law in the Sobornoye Eulogenia of 1649, which among other things permanently enserfed the Russian peasantry, a brutal measure that solved the problem of social mobility and flight by eliminating it. And they developed an increasingly sophisticated apparatus of state surveillance and control, the forerunner of the secret police institutions that would characterize Russian governance for the next 4 centuries. But they could not eliminate the myth, the belief that somewhere out there a true Tsar existed, that the present ruler was a fraud or a usurper or an antichrist, persisted in Russian popular culture with remarkable tenacity. It found expression not just in rebellions but in folklore, in religious sectarianism, in the old believer communities who rejected the Niconian church reforms of the 1650s and 1660s and who saw the Reformed Church and its Tsar as agents of Satan. It found expression in the persistent rumors, after Peter the Great's death, that he had been replaced by a changeling, that the real Peter had been imprisoned somewhere, and the monster on the throne was an impostor. The false Dmitry had not invented this tradition, but he had given it its most dramatic and consequential expression, and the template he established proved almost impossible to erase. There is a final layer to this story that deserves attention, and it concerns not the pretender himself, but the way his memory was subsequently managed. The Romanov dynasty, which owed its own existence partly to the chaos the false Dmitry had helped create, had a strong institutional interest in portraying him as simply a fraud, a runaway monk, a Polish tool, a Catholic agent. This is the version of events that appears in the official chronicles, in the church condemnations, and in the work of many early modern Russian historians writing under Romanov patronage. It is also the version that influenced Alexander Pushkin when he wrote his great dramatic poem Boris Godunov in 1825, which in turn became the basis for Mussorgsky's opera of the same name in 1874, one of the masterpieces of Russian musical culture. In Pushkin's telling, the pretender is a cynical adventurer, clever and amoral, exploiting popular credulity for personal ambition. It is a compelling portrait, but it is also a politically convenient one. Later historians, particularly in the 19th and 20th centuries, began to complicate this picture. Nikolai Kostomarov, writing in the 1860s, offered a more sympathetic reading of the false Dmitry as a genuine reformer whose innovations, however brief, pointed toward possibilities that Russian autocracy consistently refused to explore. Soviet historians, for their part, were interested in the Smuda primarily as a class conflict. The Cossack and peasant dimensions of the uprising were emphasized, while the pretender himself was somewhat sidelined as a bourgeois or feudal irrelevancy. Neither reading is entirely satisfying because the false Dmitry resists easy categorization. He was simultaneously a symptom of systemic crisis and an individual of genuine, if erratic, agency. He was a fraud who governed seriously, a pretender who believed in something, even if we are not entirely sure what, and a ruler whose 11 months in power left a mark on Russian political memory out of all proportion to the brevity of his reign. What ultimately destroyed him was not the exposure of his fraud. His identity was disputed from the beginning, and millions of people chose to believe him anyway. But his failure to understand the cultural logic of the institution he had seized. He behaved like a European monarch in a court that demanded a Russian Tsar. He was informal where he should have been distant, curious where he should have been certain, flexible where he should have been absolute. In trying to be a better ruler, he became a less convincing one. And in the brutal political theater of early modern Russia, conviction was everything. The Tsar was not merely an administrator, he was an icon. And an icon that behaved like a man was no longer an icon. The bells of Moscow that rang on the morning of May 17, 1606, did not ring for a pretender's death. They rang for the restoration of a particular idea of what Russia was and what its ruler had to be. Not human, not reformable, not open to question. That idea would persist in various forms through the Romanov dynasty, through the Soviet period, where the cult of Lenin and then Stalin drew on many of the same psychological structures as the cult of the sacred Tsar, and into the present. The specific man who rode into Moscow in June of 1605 may have been a fraud, but the hunger that brought him there, the hunger for a ruler who was legitimate not just by force, but by something deeper, something sacred, something that could not be manufactured or elected, or simply declared that hunger was entirely real. And it has never entirely gone away.